Hi, welcome back. This is session 6, the future state of TGO and the changes that are effective from the 1st of July this year. My name is Patty Holmes. My background is I'm a co-founder of one of the original Australian medicinal cannabis ASX listed companies. I'm on the board of the MCIA and I'm a consultant in the novel therapeutic space. On the panel, I'll let you have a look at the app that will give you the bio for each of our panelists, but we have Steve from Cann Group, we've got Gordon from MedReleaf, Oliver Zugel from FoliuMed overseas, we've got Jenny from the TGO and Clare, another one of the industry consultants. So for the changes, I know there's been a lot of questions and the TGA has done some education on the changes that are coming up. So this will just be a discussion about the changes and how companies are preparing and how the space will look post 1st of July next year. So my first question is, how have companies been preparing for the upcoming changes? Steve, would you like to have a swing at that one? Oh, no, sorry, Gordon, I think you were going to go first. I'm not sure.
Yeah, Patty, thanks for the question. It's a good one to get this session started, I think. And we've heard from previous panels that the Australian industry, medicinal cannabis industry, is a maturing industry, and with that becomes maturing legislations. For those less familiar with the TGO 93 amendments, they were introduced in March last year, with a transition phase ending in the 1st of July when they'll be effective from that date. Now, there's been some changes to it, and one of the major changes, as well as some minor ones, is that the requirement for manufacturers overseas to have a GMP certification that's recognised by the TGA. Now, to that extent, the local manufacturers have had to meet that from the get-go anyway. And I heard people say on the previous panels that this would help level the playing field. To me, the TGA is not so much levelling the playing field, but it's their responsibility to the public to make sure that the medicine is safe, it's consistent quality and of high quality. So that's the reasoning behind this change. Having said that, Australia has mutual recognition agreements with several countries overseas, and because of that, there are some GMP certifications which are recognised by the TGA straight away, and these countries are listed in these amendments. The countries that consist of the EU countries and UK, there's Israel, South Africa, New Zealand, and Canada. And Canada is a special case in that Canada is a very mature cannabis supplier, and they've had to, Health Canada was, to ensure quality, had a GPP certification, which is good production practices for cannabis. And in Canada's case, they can have a Health Canada establishment licence, I think it's called, or something like that. Or they can have GPP in addition to a EU GMP certification, or GPP and in addition a certification from the TGA that they meet the PICS requirement for GMP. And this latter one is also a method which countries not listed on that amendments can also get approval. So all the companies that haven't already got their certification will need to will be in a process of doing that. A lot of them would be heading towards EU GMP anyway, as it's a higher standard, and they want to, if they want to sell to Europe, they have to have that anyway. In addition to that, I think that the companies have to realise that they're going to have data to support any things they say about expiry dates and shelf life. The TGA at any time has always been able to ask for supporting data, and you've got to make sure your data is reliable and trustworthy, and so that data has to be also prepared, tested by certified laboratories, and depending on whether it's for the finished product or for developmental phase. But as an introduction, that's probably where we're at the moment. So if companies haven't already got their A into gear, then they're going to be a bit behind the 8 ball, I think. I don't know if Steve's got anything to add. As a local manufacturer, Steve might have something to say.
Yeah, thanks for that, Gordon. Cann Group, if you're unaware, is a local cultivator of medicinal cannabis. In fact, the first Australian company to be issued with a licence to do so by the ODC. So we've been working on cultivation for quite some time. Therefore, we are a self-provider of starting materials for the most part, but we also manufacture a variety of forms. Peter, our CEO, spoke before, did mention that we have a variety of different presentations, and early on we were importers of finished products. We no longer do that anymore, but so I guess where I'm talking hopefully is in a position of a company that's affected by TGO 93 in the same way that hopefully a number of people in the rooms are, whether they're importers, local manufacturers, or hybrid of all of them. I guess our personal experience in terms of preparing for TGO 93 was because of the fact that we had so many presentations in various forms, that naturally turned into quite a collection of artwork and labels that had to be reviewed against the new requirements to be brought in. For the most part, I think we were rather close to what's now being introduced in any case, but that was because of a different way of presenting the strength of the active ingredients. But there was quite a significant amount of work in undertaking an audit of all our labels and introducing the new wording around plant preparations and plant material to make sure that the dry flower minimums were also introduced at the same time. Obviously, post-COVID with supply chain issues, having that all coordinated, prepared in time. There's colleagues in the room that did the majority of that heavy lifting, and thanks for those guys to get it all in place. But for all our products to organise, to have ourselves ready to make that transition to the new artwork was quite a big one. Also, I guess the start of the section 3 of the TGO 93 starts with a paragraph around the exemptions, and carefully considering whether some of those starting materials fell within or outside of those exemptions was also a significant task that we had to undertake. As I said, for the most part we do produce our own starting materials, but there are some products that we do source starting materials for overseas, and I guess the example, the most obvious one that most people will be aware of, would be something like dry flour to be brought in. If it's going to be used for subsequent manufacturing steps, putting in mind to what did occur overseas, in what country, with what licenses, certificates or other GMP equivalents in places, if there were manufacturing steps undertaken there, such as sterilisation of the plant. So they were probably the two areas that we focused on the most. So I can go into further detail if you require, but given time,
that's great.
I might move on. Yeah.
That's a great starting point, and they are very key sections to the updated TGO 93. And I'd like to ask you, Clare, as a consultant to the industry, what are companies coming to you with? What do you see?
Yeah, so it's been a really interesting and varied set of questions. Some companies have been really prepared and have been preparing for a while. Others have kind of realised last minute that they might not have got their supply chain under control. But essentially what I'm seeing is a couple of different things. There was a lot of questions associated with at what point in time is dried flour considered to need to be GMP versus non-GMP. That's one of being the biggest questions. And then subsequently, who in Australia can pack off flour and who's got the GMP licences. The other one was a lot of companies overseas who were meeting the EU requirements for the novel food or foods, was about how did they actually either partner. I've had companies who've gone into partnerships and actually done technology transfers, so I've been doing work on technology transfers, which also then brings up the biggest question about stability. And I think I was really pleased to see the TGA flag that's an area they're going to focus on, because there has been certain people who haven't taken that into consideration, or I've had to slow down people to say that they were ready to bring product in now and had a look and said, what's the stability at? And it's a really, probably an easier answer for your oils where you can do your accelerated stability trials. The dried flour, it's hit and miss about whether an accelerated trial works or not. So generally people looking to bring dried flour in are having to wait time because they didn't have the necessary stability data, even though technically they should have. There's been some elements of, and even what their stability program for their manufacturer looks like. Do they actually have the right documentation for bracketing and bridging, etc.? So it's been a lot of work around that space.
Right.
And also it's been a lot of connecting people with the compliant manufacturers in the supply chain.
And Jenny, from your perspective, the TGA has shown us recently a crackdown on the in the advertising space with the review of companies' websites. So I'm going to assume, without giving away any secrets, that there will be enforcement in the space. And I think an interesting perspective on enforcement is who is responsible? Who are the responsible parties here?
Yeah, so I guess that's a very fair question. And just to clarify, the advertising requirements are applied in a different branch. So I'm in the manufacturing quality branch, so advertising is definitely not my area of expertise. Let's just step away from that quickly. But the enforcement, if you will, and the compliance activities for the quality of medicinal cannabis supply does sit within our branch. So we've developed and put in place the updates to the TGO 93, and we are looking at post-implementation type reviews and compliance activities. So within our branch we already do compliance in terms of GMP. That's for both domestic sites who are licensed by the TGA and any compliance signals we receive overseas, from overseas sites that may affect products supplied in Australia. So we have that compliance group already. It will have to be tackled slightly differently for the medicinal cannabis because it is coming in via the SAS and AP approval processes. That, however, will sit within our branch with close liaison with other areas within the TGA. So, so there are other avenues, and it is analogous with what we're doing already in terms of manufacturing. But bringing, of course, one of our closest partners will be the TGA laboratories. So they've already done, I think, 2 testing campaigns to address specific problems that have been raised with us, and we will similarly be doing that as necessary as part of our compliance activities.
Right. Yep. Very good, thank you. Everyone, for questions, please use your app, and we can see them come up here on the monitor, so I'll try and be up to date on the questions that are coming up on the monitor. So any questions, please do feel free to submit them. So the first one we have is, should importers also have to have TGO 93? Did you see that one? Sorry, it keeps scrolling.
Yeah,
Here we go.
saw that
Sorry,
one.
it's back.
So it's moving fast.
Yeah. Okay.
So the question is TGO testing against TGO 93. If the importers are doing that, does it have to be the same as if you were doing it in Australia? Easy. Yes. That's the whole point. If you're manufacturing in Australia, every step of manufacture has to be at a GMP licensed site. If you're doing it overseas for medicinal cannabis, you have to do it in the same way. That's exactly what we're after here. This is the level playing field that everyone's talking about.
Sorry, that isn't my question, but I'd just like to clarify, it's the testing requirements. So Tasmanian Botanics as an AUGMP certified facility needs to engage with a GMP validated lab in order to have valid results for release on our COAs. Are the same standards going to be applied to importers as well?
Yes.
Do they have to have an AUGMP certified laboratory on their manufacturing or importing license?
So if they're doing their testing overseas, that testing laboratory will need to have GMP that we have said is equivalent to what's going on in Australia. If they're testing in Australia, then it has to be at a licensed site.
And is there any requirement, or will there be any requirements for people to, like if they import material from overseas and they have a COA which is like 6 months ago, should they have to get it retested when it comes in the country?
So what are they doing with the raw material when they bring it into the country?
For finished goods packaging, if it's a starting material or if you are importing like finished goods into the country, how long does your COA stand for before it's like not valid? Because we have seen like COAs which have been, dated months and months and months in the past, sometimes even years. So I'm just interested.
For the starting material or the finished goods? Both. So this goes back to the stability question we've just addressed. So the shelf life and stability has been raised as one of the major concerns with quality in Australia. So that is what's being addressed now. And one, is your testing methodology appropriate and fully validated? And my goodness, please, yes, do that. To whoever had the conversation before about laboratories and the variation between labs. But yes, so I think we've got to,
So the answer is you only need to do retesting if you are going to extend your shelf life. So if you've got a stability data that validates a 2-year shelf life for your product, you do your testing and release C of A. It could be 23 months old because you only need to that because you've got your stability data that proves that the information on that C of A will be valid for the shelf life of your product.
So Jenny, just correct me if I'm wrong. For the final release of the product, it needs to be tested by a GMP certified laboratory. But for non-patient use testing, like for shelf life, if it's just for research, that type of thing, it could be an ISO 17025 laboratory. Is that correct? If it's not for the patient
so
use.
this is where I say I am not a GMP expert. Analytical chemist by training, know a little bit about GMP, so I would have to take that one on notice because what we're talking about here are the commercially supplied products under SAS and AP.
Yes, but
Yep.
the stability data might be generated by a laboratory, but that product is not actually getting released for public patient use. As I said, my understanding was that to be released for patient use, the final testing has to be a GMP laboratory. But for this just plain stability studies only, that an ISO 17025 laboratory would suffice. That's my understanding.
Not in Australia, if you're doing it in Australia, for the finished product.
No, not the finished product.
The raw material.
The stability studies
Yes.
of the finished product, but not the product that's getting released for public use.
Okay, let's wrap this one up. Okay, we'll take that one on notice.
Very
Okay,
complicated area.
we've got a good one for you, Jenny. If you find a non-compliant product, is that an issue solely for the product sponsor or does it go wider?
Love it.
Yep.
Regulatory science, love this question. So under the Therapeutic Goods Act, there are penalties for anybody who supplies, so import, export or supplies a product that doesn't comply with the standard. Anybody. It's not just the sponsor, it's the wholesaler, it's the pharmacist, it's anybody who passes those goods on. So for those of you who may be slightly familiar with the regulatory framework, we do have a consent provision under section 14 and 14A of the Act, where the Secretary or the Secretary's delegate can give consent to supply goods that don't meet a quality standard, but the delegate has determined that there's no safety or efficacy risk. When we give that consent, we don't give it to, this is for medicines, we don't give it to a party. We don't give it to the sponsor. We just say there is consent to supply that non-compliant good in Australia. So it applies across the board. So if there is TGO 93 non-compliant goods out there, anybody in the supply chain is open to those penalty provisions. It's a really important point. It's not just the sponsor's legal responsibility.
So anybody who's touched it,
Anybody
along
who
that
supplies
pathway,
it in that supply chain.
Yep.
Correct.
Is responsible.
Yep.
Okay, that's great. Oliver, you have been remarkably quiet sitting there, which is very out of character for you. So tell us, from an overseas perspective, how are Australian companies interacting with you to meet the requirements of this the updated TGO 93?
So, probably just by way of history, how we set ourselves up. So when we started the company, the first thing we did, we had a cultivation extraction operation in Colombia, which was not GMP. We realized very quickly that to go to a GMP standard, we would need to make a deal with a pharmaceutical company in Germany, which is what we ended up doing, because actually building the whole GMP experience, Jennifer and others will know, it's a major undertaking. So fundamentally, what we did is set ourselves up from the beginning with a GMP facility which had been operating with opioids for 30 years. So there the GMP was just daily business practice. And it started to transcend throughout the rest of the organization. So this is for the people who are actually trying to build this. It's quite hard if you don't have a organizational structure where from the top this is being pulled. I think it's otherwise quite complicated. So you try to do this somehow differently, you'll struggle. So this is just from our own end of how we got there. With regards to our Australian customers, Australia for us is one of the largest markets where we're in, with obviously doing a lot in South America as well as in Germany. But some of the early movers have been working with us probably for close to...
Oh, is
No,
that
okay,
time up?
not me.
No.
Okay, good. Sounded like mine. Working with us probably for 18 months, I would think, setting up supply chain, stability testing.
So, sorry, that's 18 months you've been working on the transition to a GMP
For
supply
white
with...
label provision to Australian companies. 18 months we started to do this. Another customer we started about 12 months ago. So, and the guys who were very early in the game were the large producers, of course. So the guys on the top 10, they understand that this is what was required. But it's a significant setup time. I mean, significant effort. And I think that's what it takes. So it would strike me that people who haven't done it by now, they may underestimate of resetting up the supply chain. I think by now you're actually pretty late. So then I guess what's happening is that you're starting to stock up with non-GMP product. Then the whole stability issue comes into place because I stock up for 3 years and have no stability data, then it becomes quite complicated to commercialize it. But that's
or
the
a
situation.
big batch of stability data.
Yeah. So I think that's what we're seeing. So it's quite a mixed picture, but as not surprisingly, the guys best prepared to do this were obviously the companies who are the largest and have a GMP philosophy kind of from the beginning already.
Right. Thank you. Thank you. And Claire, what do you see as the biggest stumbling blocks for companies transitioning from non-GMP to GMP supply?
Look, I think part of it is, and this is meant no disrespect to the industry because I've been in the whole time, is there's still a lot of people who are very naive in the industry that in some respects are lured in by cannabis as being something that is an amazing product, and it is. I'm a patient. It makes a big difference to me on a daily basis. But they therefore don't know the depth of what the regulations are. So they read TGO 93 and think that they're across the regulations for medicinal cannabis. It actually goes all the way back to the TGA Act, so I think that's been the biggest issue, is that people thought they had plenty of time, thought some things were a nice to have rather than a must have, and so they've been spending, it's been really interesting for them to, and I think they can do things quickly. So some of the biggest lessons from a lot of people was to probably times their timelines by 2 or 3, 4, to make sure they do things slowly and properly, and the players who are taking it seriously are the ones who have actually very quickly decided to slow down, do things properly, look at things if they wanted unique, and also people are changing their strategy on things. I think you'll see some products leave the market. We've already seen a few discontinued products because of this change, which is a good thing. The sponsors are being responsible in what they're doing there. But I think that it is absolutely the fact that there needs to be people who are providing that independent consultancy or the industry associations, etc. Labels has been another really big thing. A lot of people, dried flower, it's pretty clear about what goes on, but the second biggest question I'm probably asked is, how do you put your equivalents of dry weight on an oil? So I think we had this conversation, Jenny, the other week.
Yep.
So that's been, and I think that will still be the case, and I think if TGA did a labelling webinar, and I think that that's something that having questions and more, the industry association putting more questions out on the labelling would be wonderful.
Can I just jump in quick with time?
Yeah.
So you've got clients of yours that haven't noticed how quickly the time can pass on these things. I mean, I think there's certain scenarios where time isn't so much of an issue, and then there's others, and the therapeutic goods order itself sets out certain jurisdictions where GMP equivalents can be sought by way of certificate or similar, and then others that require TGA inspection. Maybe, I'm not sure this is for you, Claire, or for you, Jenny, but what's the timeline looking like at the moment if somebody was to request the TGA to go to a country to undertake a
I can tell you what TGA quoted me, and then Jenny can tell you what's at. So TGA quoted me anywhere between 12 to 18 months. So 12 was the minimum, 18 was more likely to schedule in an overseas inspection. So I don't know whether that's...
Yeah, I think that's just a reality. So we are still suffering for, I think one of my colleagues said, the COVID hangover. And that's not from a personal experience of COVID, but it's more the things that we could not get done. In fact, I'd like to say that I think TGA, and particularly, I'm going to blow our own trumpet, MQE kept up their inspections as much as we possibly could under some incredibly difficult, no international travel, restricted travel. Every time people, it seemed as though every time we booked an internal domestic inspection, some state would shut their borders and off we'd go again. So incredibly difficult and changing requirements over those couple of years. We've got a backlog. And whilst medicinal cannabis is a really important product for many, many patients in Australia, I'm sorry. In fact, I'm not going to apologise. Our focus has been on COVID vaccines, COVID treatments, and other critical medicines. So we are working through, we've got a prioritisation. We have said if you put in a request for an inspection for a medicinal cannabis product, please flag it so we can look at it and be aware of it and progress it as swiftly as we can. But it's going into the queue. And it's, realistically, it's 12 to 18 months. So if you are looking at requesting an inspection for an overseas site, put it in as soon as you possibly can, when you think the site is ready to go, or pretty much ready to go on that kind of a timeline, and talk to us. So we know what's going on and we can advise you. So I reiterate that regardless of the area I've worked in within the TGA, if you've got a problem, please come and talk to us. Yeah.
Great, thank you. And I do think that people in the industry, people tend to be a bit wary of interacting with the TGA, but I always encourage, go there, talk to them, deal with them, and you won't get told exactly what to do, but you'll be given the right direction or some good reading material to do that. So yeah, I can enforce that more. We have another interesting question here. What is the estimated number of products on market in Australia that will not meet the new standards?
I hope that's not a question for me.
Who wants to take a hit at that one? Yep, go for it, Claire. What do you think?
Well, last I checked on a database, there was 534 products in Australia. Yep. Which is a hell of a lot for the category. And I think it's a really hard question to answer on a couple of fronts, because I think a lot of the products in the market, a lot of the players have actually got works in the background to make them compliant. So whether it's changing the final, like getting the updated license, etc. I think it's going to be a relatively small percentage. I think there's going to be products July, August, September, October, who will still meet the previous standards because of it getting out to expiry. But I think 6 months in, I think we're going to have pretty compliant products. So, and I do think we'll probably see an attrition rate of some products come through, drop off. But I don't think it's going to be huge and high in the fact that I think that the biggest selling products, or as you said, the top 10 companies or top 20 to 30 companies, they've been aware of this and they're going to make sure their products are compliant. Yeah. So I think it's going to be, I don't know, maybe 10 to 20% might actually either transition to a different dosage format or drop out. But then I think we're going to be compliant. I think people are taking it seriously.
Good.
I hope they are.
Oliver?
I think it links to the prior question also with regards to pricing. So what will happen with pricing, the number of non-compliant products? It's kind of linked. I think the two things go together. On Clare's observation, probably one step back. I mean, the whole TGO 93 GMP change rule was linked back to leveling the playing field. I think the leveling the playing field must occur, but it's actually not between, in my mind, it's not between domestic and international producers, but it's between GMP producers and non-GMP producers. Doesn't matter where they're located. So this is my starting point. So it's not a foreign versus domestic, I think largely. It's GMP, independent where you are. So that's number one. Number two, if a GMP manufacturing process always is more expensive, of course the whole regulatory compliance piece is more expensive to do. So if you suddenly said, I was non-GMP before, now I become GMP, in principle your price of the product should be going up. So it's the second consideration. The third is you have so much product coming in through imports that the reality is that some of the countries where you can import from with lower costs, there you have only very few GMP producers. Mm-hmm. So where you're actually going to see a big fall off, I think in my mind, is in the product which is most affordable at this point in time, because that is likely not to have been GMP and may not be converting to GMP. Mm-hmm. So when I'm being asked and said, what is this going to do to the pricing in the industry? Frankly speaking, I don't know the answer, because on the one hand, we have, I think, less supply, less GMP supply coming in from the import side. And at the same time, people stocking up a lot of product. That product will come on the market sooner or later, and there's going to be a compliance job to figure out whether it is compliant, has the stability test, but it will come on the market at some point. I mean, the people who are bringing the product in now, pre-July, they will sell it. So it will be there. That will put the prices down, I think, at the same time. So it's really hard to predict, and I think what I exchanged with Jennifer about is this, and where the prices are heading will depend a lot on what people expect the enforcement policy will be by the TGA, I think. It's the expectation, not what they end up doing. It's like, if people expect there to be very harsh and strict enforcement on the piece, I think you may have some unintended consequences on the pricing, and therefore potentially also access issues. But that's the dilemma I think you need to work with between the safety, efficacy, and the access and the pricing side. So it's not that clear to me. But I think where I would take a bit different stance to her is, I think, imported product, which, so let's say from the US, which was cheap, hemp derived. So in the US, it was cheap. From Canada, you only had a handful of GMP guys anyhow. From South America, again, this is less than a handful. So this is very few people. So the low-cost imports, I think, in some form will become a bit more complicated. And therefore, yes, probably stimulate domestic production, which may be in part what you're trying to achieve.
And I guess also on that subject, maybe for you, Jenny, is does the TGA see any particular problems being raised by suppliers of dried flour as a finished dosage form? Oh, sorry. It'd be nice if you had a mic.
I think that one ties into one of the similar questions that's here about bulk shelf life and
so yeah, just that question as well.
Yeah, is the product packed in Australia, does the TGA add the bulk shelf life to the packed goods? Our understanding is the expiry starts at packing. I'm assuming that's to do with flour. Yeah. Now, in a traditional pharmaceutical world, there's not a heck of a lot of difference between the raw material and the finished product. When you're talking about imported flour, we're talking a whole different game here. So that's when it becomes more difficult, but you've got to go back to that basic principle. On that commercially supplied finished product, you're going to put a shelf life. Do you have the data to support that that is going to meet its label claim for its shelf life? How you go establishing that is the sponsor and the manufacturer's responsibility. So yes, this is one of the questions we're getting about imported dried flour. So we get the question about shelf life. The other question we get is, but it's just going to be thrown into a package here in Australia and labelled GMP compliant, at which stage my non-professional GMP, because I used to work as a technical expert going on GMP inspections many years ago, just makes my blood boil, because I'm sorry, any of you GMP licensed manufacturers out there will know it's more than just throwing it into a package. It's your site, it's the training, it's your staff, it's the release for supply, that final step in manufacture. So it's not just have you got a packaging line, it's that whole suite of GMP, and that's what we're going to be looking at. If this is the area that both patients, consumers, healthcare practitioners are worried about the quality of goods, and it's on the basis of flour that's being imported, those GMP licensed sites that are doing those final steps of manufacture in Australia, clearly within TGA's remit.
Okay. Yep. Thank you. The other question I have for you, sorry, while you've got the microphone in your hand, can you talk about the changes that allow Australian cultivators to supply compounders who don't hold a TGA GMP licence?
Yeah, so this was another change that when we were looking at TGA 93 and the discussions about compounded medicines, and so the additional requirement that compounded medicines had to be supplied under the SAS or the AP, and the recognition that up until that point Australian cultivators weren't able to supply to compounding. So when I say compounders, I mean unlicensed compounders. So their current exemption in the Australian regulations, pharmacists can compound under the requirements of the Pharmacy Board and their own professional practice guidelines, can compound if there's not a medicine suitable for their patient that's commercially available. And at this stage, commercially available is defined as on the register. So by creating making that level playing field then has to work back the other way. So the narcotic drug regulations were changed to allow domestic manufacturers to supply to an unlicensed compounder. The problem there is that only works, the exemption, current exemption under our regulations, if they themselves are GMP licensed. So at some point in that supply chain, regardless whether you're domestically manufacturing or doing it overseas, somebody has to have appropriate GMP. So there are exemptions for some starting materials if those starting materials are going to a licensed manufacturer for manufacturing into finished dosage form. If the manufacturer into the finished dosage form is not licensed, i.e. an unlicensed compounder, then the supplier of the starting material doesn't satisfy the exemptions. They must have GMP, be it licensed in Australia or approved overseas. And so that matching has to occur. One of the things that was raised directly in some of our discussions, and I had to have a think about, but I've now confirmed, is if that unlicensed API manufacturer, if you will, sends their product out to a GMP licensed, and I'm using that sort of in the general term because the overseas ones aren't licensed, but bear with me, sends it to a licensed laboratory for testing, or sends it to a licensed manufacturer for sterilisation, does that still satisfy the exemption for GMP licensing for the API manufacturer? The answer is no, because you're subcontracting to have a service. You haven't given it to a licensed finished dosage manufacturer. So if you send it out for testing and then give it to the compounders, no, you haven't met the terms of the exemption. So I think that kind of nuance isn't well understood, and we're going to have to put a bit of extra guidance out there to help people with that one. Yeah.
Great,
yeah.
great. Thanks for that. Hold on. So we kind of answered what are the timeframes for GMP assessments by TGO. We're saying 12 to 18 months.
Can I jump in? It doesn't look like we've got a new question on there, but we've had a long period of time to consider these changes, how they're coming in. Just looking back, the rationale for the update in the first place, and maybe on the quality section, the manufacturing section, and this is a question for you, Jenny, what was the key goal that was trying to be achieved by these updates, and with the benefit of hindsight and time, do you think that we're set up now to be able to solve that issue? And I think it's an equivalent product quality issue, but maybe it's something else.
I'm happy with your setup.
Yep.
Is this going to be the end of updates to TGO 93? No. I don't want to be doing it every year. I don't want to be doing it every 2 years. I mean, there was a discussion earlier about changing regulatory requirements. We don't do it because we think it might be a great idea. Let me tell you, it's a lot of work, and it involves close consultation to make sure that what we're doing in a regulatory perspective is appropriate. Is it appropriate to risk? Is it reasonable? So that's one answer. I've forgotten the first bit.
The key reason for the update in the first place on the manufacturing section.
So partly it's the level playing field. Medicinal cannabis coming into Australia and being supplied under SAS and AP is a whole new ballgame. Generally, medicines supplied in Australia are on the ARTG. It's only those unique products, it's only those unique situations when there isn't a commercially available product that a healthcare practitioner will look overseas. And normally when they look overseas, they get a product that's somebody else has approved, US FDA, EU, wherever. That's not the case with the medicinal cannabis, and it becomes increasingly obvious that we needed to do that extraordinary, and I think it is an extraordinary step, of creating a quality standard for something that's not on the register. So that preliminary TGO that was put, the first version of the TGO 93, and I have to confess it was clearly written with the expectation that the industry would progress to isolates. It was written that they were pharmaceuticals. Clearly not fit for purpose for many of the products out in Australia. So that's why we ended up having to do the labelling things. And quite frankly, it was a bit of a surprise to me, surely everybody knows how to label a herbal product. Come on. We've got information already in some of our guidance, but this is a different industry. So I think TGA is reacting to that whole, this is a different ballgame. We have to do things slightly differently here. So that was the reason for the inclusion of the labelling requirements. But it's not prescriptive like the TGO 91 and 92, which in essence helps people design a label that is going to be appropriate, to go onto the register. It's not that comprehensive because there's a whole range of products. And look, now I'm going way off topic. The other thing I see that's a problem with the TGO 93 is it's geared to oral dosage forms. Listening to the conversation here, even if it was, again, it went back to this is going to be an isolate, a pharmaceutical, and they're not. So that's something. Sorry, Paul, don't know where you're out there. You thought you were overdone with So Paul Crosley is our person who worked closely on the TGO 93 updates with me. I think your work is not yet done. So yeah, it very much is. So I think it's those two things. The level playing field, concerns from healthcare practitioners about understanding what product they're getting. So if they've got something that's labelled X amount of THC and Y amount of CBD, and they get another one that's got that same on it, but they get completely different therapeutic effects, how do they know that that's an equivalent product? They needed that additional information on, because we're complex natural products, some of these extracts. So that was the one reason, and then, bringing it in.
Thanks.
Yep. Great. Thank you. And we're out of time, but thank you. Can we please thank all of our panellists for a very robust discussion? We could probably sit here for another 2 hours to continue the debate, but unfortunately our time is over and the next session will begin shortly. Thank you.